In August 1100, the body of the King of England was found lying face down in the mud of the New Forest. But the church didn't mourn, they rejoiced. Their verdict was brutal. The filthy sodomite has finally been sent to hell. This was William Rufus. He was a king who openly challenged the rigid masculine ideals of the Middle Ages. He refused to take a queen. He even refused the absolute duty of a monarch to produce an heir. Instead of filling his court with grim warriors, he surrounded himself with beautiful young men wearing silk robes and long braided hair. 900 years ago, in a suffocatingly religious world, he used his absolute power to carve out a sanctuary for his own desires. So, when that arrow pierced his heart, was it truly just a hunting accident? Or was it a hate crime, a conspiracy by an entire era to wipe out a heretic they viewed as a monster? To find the answer, we must turn the clock back 13 years. We must leave the forest and enter a room in Rouen that smells of sickness and fear. The year is 1087. In the priory of Saint-Gervais, just outside the city walls, the most terrifying man in Europe is dying. William the Conqueror, the man who broke the spine of England at Hastings, is now reduced to a groaning, bloated wreck. His death was not glorious. There was no final charge on a battlefield. Instead, there was a clumsy accident. While riding through the burning ruins of Mantes, a town he had just torched in a rage, his horse stumbled on a hot coal. The saddle pommel slammed into his stomach, rupturing his intestines. For weeks, he has lain in agony, his body poisoning itself. The atmosphere in the death chamber is not one of mourning, but of panic. The king's breath comes in ragged gasps, and with every breath, the stability of the Western world threatens to collapse. Standing by his bedside is not a loving family, but a collection of vultures waiting for the carcass to cool. Among them is his third son. He is about 30, stocky, barrel-chested, with a face that flushes red at the slightest provocation. This is William, known as Rufus. To understand the tragedy that will later happen in the New Forest, you have to understand the dynamic here. The Conqueror had 3 surviving sons. Robert, the eldest, was charming but lazy and easily manipulated. Henry, the youngest, was cold, brilliant, and ruthless, but landless. And in the middle was Rufus, aggressive, martial, and his father's mirror image. On his deathbed, the Conqueror made a decision that would doom his family to a generation of war. Tradition dictated the eldest son gets everything, but the Conqueror hated Robert. He couldn't bear the thought of his hard-won England falling into Robert's incompetent hands. So he found a loophole. He left Normandy to Robert to satisfy tradition. But England? England was the prize of his sword. He placed the crown in the hands of God, but whispered a specific instruction to Rufus. Cross the channel. Take the treasury. Seize the throne before Robert knows the old man is dead. The moment the Conqueror's eyes closed on September 9th, 1087, the room exploded into chaos. It was disgraceful. The wealthy barons and bishops didn't stay to pray. They ran to their horses to secure their estates. The servants, seeing their masters flee, stripped the room bare. They stole the linen, the candlesticks, even the clothes off the king's body. For hours, the corpse of the greatest warrior of the age lay naked and abandoned on the floor of a looted room, gathering dust. Rufus did not stay for the funeral. He knew that sentimentality was a death sentence in this family. While the servants were looting the death chamber, Rufus was already galloping for the coast. He needed to cross the English Channel before the autumn storms made it impossible, and before his brother Robert, who was living in exile in France, could mobilize. It was a race for a kingdom. Rufus carried with him only a signet ring and a letter from his father, addressed to Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The funeral of the Conqueror, which Rufus missed, served as a grim omen for the reign to come. When the body was finally brought to Caen for burial, a fire broke out in the city, distracting the mourners. Then, during the ceremony, a local knight interrupted the proceedings, shouting that the church was built on land stolen from his father and forbidding the burial. The flustered clergy had to pay him off with silver on the spot just to proceed. Finally, when they tried to lower the king's body into the stone sarcophagus, they realized the masons had made it too narrow. The king had become bloated in the heat. As the attendants tried to force the corpse into the hole, pushing and shoving the swollen limbs, the body burst. The stomach ruptured, releasing weeks of decomposition and putrefaction into the church. The smell was so overpowering that the incense couldn't hide it. Priests retched, and the congregation fled the building with their hands over their mouths. The Conqueror, the man who had terrified millions, ended his time on earth as a source of grotesque horror. Meanwhile, William Rufus was in England, moving with the terrifying efficiency that would define his rule. He didn't go to the barons, he went to the money. He rode straight to Winchester, the ancient capital, and seized the royal treasury. It was filled with silver pennies, gold vessels, and gemstones, the hoarded loot of the conquest. With the money in his hand, he held the keys to power. He then presented his father's letter to Archbishop Lanfranc. Lanfranc was the moral guardian of the realm, a man of immense prestige. He had raised Rufus and educated him. Although he knew Rufus's volatile nature, he also knew that Robert was a disaster, and Henry was too young. Lanfranc made his choice. On September 26, 1087, just 2 weeks after his father's death, William Rufus was crowned King William II in Westminster Abbey. The English people, the conquered Anglo-Saxons, who made up 98% of the population, watched this transition with a weary fatalism. To them, it was just one French-speaking tyrant replacing another. They did not know yet that Rufus would be a different kind of master. They did not know that this stocky, red-faced young man would eventually appeal to them, the defeated English, to save him from his own Norman kin. The peace of the coronation lasted less than 6 months. The problem was structural and inevitable. The aristocracy of the Anglo-Norman world were amphibious creatures. They held vast estates in Normandy and vast estates in England. Now, those two territories were ruled by two different brothers who hated each other. Robert ruled Normandy, Rufus ruled England. If a baron obeyed Rufus, he risked losing his lands in Normandy to Robert. If he obeyed Robert, he risked losing his lands in England to Rufus. It was an impossible situation. The barons sitting in their stone keeps realized there was only one solution. The two realms had to be reunited under one man, and they chose Robert. Not because Robert was better, but because he was weaker. A weak king meant strong barons. A king like Rufus, who was already showing signs of his father's iron will, was bad for business. In the spring of 1088, the plot was hatched. It was led by the most powerful man in England after the king, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. Odo was the Conqueror's half-brother, Rufus's uncle. He was a warrior bishop, a man who fought with a mace because canon law forbade priests from drawing blood with a sword. Crushing skulls was apparently a theological loophole he enjoyed. Odo had been in prison for years under the Conqueror, but Rufus, in a gesture of early goodwill, had released him. Odo repaid this kindness by organizing a massive conspiracy to dethrone his nephew. The scale of the rebellion of 1088 was terrifying. It wasn't just a few disgruntled lords. It was almost the entire ruling class. From the Kentish coast to the Welsh marches, the Norman barons rose up. They fortified their castles, burned the king's farms, and waited for Robert to sail from Normandy with an invasion fleet. Rufus found himself in a desperate position. He was a king without a nobility. His own court was dissolving as men slipped away to join the rebels. He was isolated in London with enemies closing in from every compass point. This was the moment William Rufus came alive. Lesser men would have fled or sued for peace. Rufus went on the offensive. He realized that if the Norman aristocracy was against him, he had to find a new weapon. He did something that had been unthinkable since 1066. He turned to the English. Rufus sent out messengers to the shires, summoning the Fyrd, the ancient Anglo-Saxon militia. He issued a proclamation that was a masterpiece of political manipulation. He promised the English that he would restore their best laws. He promised to abolish the unjust taxes and the hated forest laws that prevented them from hunting. He spoke to them not as a foreign conqueror, but as their king, defending the realm against traitorous lords. The English response was stunning. For 20 years, they had been humiliated, robbed, and oppressed by these Norman barons, by men like Odo. Now the king himself was giving them a license to kill these oppressors. 30,000 Englishmen flocked to Rufus's banner. They came with spears, axes, and bows, eager for revenge against the local lords who had made their lives a misery. It was a surreal sight, the son of the Conqueror marching at the head of an English peasant army to kill his father's knights. Rufus struck first at the heart of the rebellion, Odo. The bishop had holed up in Pevensey Castle on the south coast, waiting for Robert's fleet. Rufus marched his army south and laid siege to the castle. For 6 weeks, the English army surrounded the Norman fortress. They were ruthless. When Robert finally sent a relief fleet from Normandy, the English sailors loyal to Rufus intercepted them at sea and slaughtered them, throwing their bodies into the waves. Robert, true to his lazy nature, never came himself. Inside Pevensey, food ran out. Odo, the great plotter, was forced to surrender. He came out expecting the usual aristocratic slap on the wrist. He expected to be fined and sent back to his estates, but he had misjudged his nephew. Rufus was furious. He dragged Odo in chains to Rochester Castle, where other rebels were still holding out, and forced the bishop to shout commands at the walls, ordering the garrison to surrender. The garrison, seeing their leader in chains, simply jeered and shot arrows at him. The siege of Rochester was the final act. It was a brutal, grinding affair in the heat of summer. Disease broke out inside the castle. The chroniclers tell us that huge flies, bred in the filth of the castle yard, tormented the defenders until they could barely eat or sleep. Finally, the rebels broke. They marched out, defeated. The English troops in Rufus's army screamed for their blood. They shouted, "Halters! Bring halters! Hang the traitors!" They wanted to see the Norman lords swinging from the trees. Rufus, however, showed a moment of cold political genius. He denied the English their bloodlust. He spared the rebels. He exiled Odo and stripped the others of some lands, but he did not execute them. He knew that he still had to rule these people. If he started chopping off the heads of the most powerful families in the land, he would create blood feuds that would never end. He needed them broken, not dead. By showing mercy, he proved he was the master. The rebellion of 1088 was the forge that made the king. It proved to the world that William Rufus was not a placeholder. He was a formidable general and a brilliant tactician who could think outside the rigid boxes of feudal loyalty. He had secured his throne against overwhelming odds. But the victory came at a price. The promises he had made to the English, the good laws, the tax relief, were instantly forgotten. Once the danger passed, Rufus returned to being a Norman. The taxes remained. The forest laws became even harsher. The English realized, with bitter disappointment, that they had simply swapped a weak tyrant for a strong one. With the rebellion crushed, Rufus was supreme. But now, with the noise of battle fading, the eyes of the kingdom turned to the king's court, and what they saw began to disturb them more than any war. The court of William Rufus was changing. The old stern advisers of his father were dying off or being pushed aside. In their place came a new generation of young men. They were flamboyant, witty, and arrogant. They mocked the solemnity of the church. They spent fortunes on clothes and hair. The king, now in his early 30s, presided over this carnival with a loud, boisterous energy. He showed zero interest in the eligible princesses of Europe. Diplomatic letters suggesting marriage alliances were left unanswered. The king preferred the company of his knights. He preferred the hunt, the feast, and the jest. To the monks scribbling in their cold cells, this was not just a lifestyle choice. It was a moral infection. They looked at the king's long hair, his clean-shaven face, his pointed shoes, and they saw the devil's work. They saw a king who was unmoored from the traditional anchors of family and faith, and they began to sharpen their quills. Rufus had conquered the barons, but he was about to start a war with an enemy that had no castle to besiege and no army to slaughter, an enemy that fought with words, excommunications, and the fear of hell. The king had secured his crown, but his soul was now the battlefield. As the 1080s drew to a close, a new figure was about to enter the stage, a holy man, a saintly intellectual who would become the oil to Rufus's water, the immovable object to his unstoppable force. His name was Anselm, and their collision would tear the spiritual heart of England apart. With the rebellion of 1088 crushed and the traitors exiled or cowed, a strange new season descended upon England. The smoke from the burning castles cleared, the peasant militias returned to their fields, and the silence of absolute authority settled over the land. But in the king's palaces at Westminster, Winchester, and Gloucester, the noise was just beginning. If the first act of William Rufus's reign was a war of iron, the second was a war of style, gold, and the soul. The king was now 32 years old. He was secure on his throne, and for the first time he could build a world that reflected his own desires. What emerged was a court culture so radically different from anything England had ever seen that it sent the chroniclers into paroxysms of rage. To walk into the great hall of William Rufus in the early 1090s was to enter a different universe from the grim, austere military camps of his father. The Conqueror's court had been a place of short hair, stiff demeanors, and practical knee-length tunics designed for men who spent their lives in the saddle. It was a court of gray and brown, smelling of wet wool and armor grease. Rufus's court was a riot of color, silk, and perfume. The transformation began with the bodies of the men themselves. The young aristocracy, the sons of the men who had hacked their way through Hastings, stopped shaving. But they didn't grow the full bushy beards of their grandfathers or the Anglo-Saxons. Instead, they cultivated long, drooping mustaches and let their hair grow wild, cascading down their backs in ringlets. They used curling irons, a scandalous vanity for men, and treated their locks with expensive oils. Then came the clothes. The tunics lengthened, sweeping the floor like the robes of women. They were cut tight at the waist to accentuate the hips and chest, made of fine silks imported from the East. The sleeves were so long they covered the hands, rendering manual labor or sword fighting impossible without first disrobing. It was a fashion of deliberate helplessness, a signal that said, "I am so powerful I do not need to be ready." But the ultimate symbol of this new decadence was the shoes. They were called pegashis, or scorpions. These were leather shoes with toes that extended inches, sometimes a foot beyond the foot itself. They were stuffed with moss or wool to keep their shape and often curled backward, resembling a scorpion's tail or a ram's horn. Men stumbled in them. They had to learn a new way of walking, a mincing, high-stepping gait, just to move across a room without tripping. The monk Orderic Vitalis, writing from his cold cell in Normandy, dipped his quill in bile to describe this. He called them filthy goats and effeminates. He wrote that the whole earth was corrupted. To the church, this wasn't just bad taste, it was a subversion of God's order. Men were created to be the head, the warrior, the stern patriarch. By blurring the lines between male and female dress, Rufus's courtiers were, in the eyes of the clergy, challenging the very definition of creation. At the center of this peacock display sat the Red King. Rufus himself did not adopt the most extreme of these fashions. He remained a soldier at heart, but he facilitated it. He enjoyed it. He surrounded himself with these beautiful, witty, flamboyant young men. He promoted them, laughed with them, and protected them from the finger-wagging of the bishops. He created a sanctuary where the strict martial masculinity of the Norman world was suspended. Was it a gay court? The modern term is anachronistic, but the behavior was undeniable. The chroniclers are explicit in their accusations of sodomy, a crime that technically carried the death penalty, but was openly tolerated in the king's presence. The silence of women in the historical record of Rufus's court is deafening. There were no queens, no mistresses, no favored ladies-in-waiting. It was a world of men, but men who had rejected the church's template for manhood. But behind the silk and the long hair, a ruthless machine was operating. Rufus was not a hedonist who neglected his duties. He was a workaholic who used hedonism as a release. While the courtiers danced, the king was building a centralized state of terrifying efficiency. His primary weapon in this administrative war was a low-born priest named Ranulph Flambard. If Rufus was the iron fist, Flambard was the grasping hand. Flambard was not a theologian. He was a bureaucrat, a financial genius with zero moral scruples. He was handsome, arrogant, and possessed a tongue so sharp it could cut glass. The king loved him. He nicknamed him Flambard, which means the torchbearer, or the incendiary, because Ranulph had a talent for burning up the old Anglo-Saxon laws to find new ways to extract money. Flambard became the king's justiciar, essentially the prime minister. His job was simple: fill the treasury, and he did it with brutal creativity. He recalculated the land measurements in the Domesday Book to squeeze more tax out of the peasants. He sold royal writs. He fined barons for minor infractions. But his greatest source of revenue, and the one that would lead to the great crisis of the reign, was the church. Under Norman law, when a bishop or abbot died, their lands reverted to the king until a new appointment was made. In the past, kings filled these vacancies quickly. Rufus and Flambard realized that if they just didn't appoint a new bishop, they could keep the revenues for themselves. In 1089, Archbishop Lanfranc, the moral compass of the kingdom, died. This was the moment Rufus had been waiting for. He refused to appoint a successor. For 4 years, the See of Canterbury, the holiest seat in England, stood empty. The vast rents from its estates, the tithes from its tenants, the gold from its altars, it all flowed straight into Rufus's war chest. He used God's money to pay for the secular extravagances of his court and to fund his military campaigns in Normandy. The church was horrified. The monks of Canterbury were leaderless. They prayed daily for the king to change his heart. They might as well have prayed to a stone. Rufus was enjoying the money too much. The bread of Christ is rich, he joked, and kings have a hunger. But in the medieval mind, God is not mocked forever. In March 1093, the bill came due. The king was at the royal manor of Alveston near Gloucester when he collapsed. It began as a fever, but rapidly descended into something darker. He lost his appetite, then his strength, and finally his ability to stand. He was confined to his bed, shivering and delirious. The royal physicians, men who relied on astrology and herbal purgatives, shook their heads. They examined his urine and declared that death was imminent. The atmosphere in the royal bedchamber shifted instantly from arrogance to terror. In the 11th century, hell was not a metaphor. It was a physical place of eternal fire, and everyone in that room, including Rufus, believed in it. The king lay sweating in his sheets, staring at the ceiling, terrified. His sins were legion. He had robbed the church, oppressed the poor, and lived a life of unnatural vice. If he died now, without confession and absolution, his soul was doomed. The bishops gathered around his bed like vultures, but this time they were vultures offering salvation for a price. They told the terrified king that he must repent. He must empty the prisons. He must restore the good laws. And most importantly, he must appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury. Rufus, weak and gasping for air, agreed to everything. "Make me a bishop," he wheezed. "Make me a Christian." But who? The bishops looked around. By chance, the most famous holy man in Europe was in England at that moment. Anselm, the abbot of Bec in Normandy, was visiting the court. Anselm was everything Rufus was not. He was 60 years old, an intellectual giant, a man of such profound gentleness and piety that he was already considered a living saint. He had no interest in power. He only wanted to think about the ontology of God. The bishops dragged Anselm to the king's bedside. Rufus pointed a trembling finger at the old monk and named him archbishop. What followed was a scene of almost slapstick violence. Anselm refused. He knew Rufus. He knew that the king's repentance was born of fear, not faith. "I am an old man," Anselm protested, backing away. "I am a monk. Do not entangle me in the affairs of the world with this wild bull of a king." The bishops wouldn't take no for an answer. They physically seized Anselm. They dragged him to the bedside. They tried to force the pastoral staff, the symbol of the office, into his hand. Anselm clenched his fist so tight that they couldn't pry his fingers open. They pried one finger open, then another, until they managed to jam the staff against his palm, holding his hand around it while they shouted, "Long live the bishop!" Anselm cried out in distress, "What are you doing? You are yoking an untamed bull and an old feeble sheep to the same plow." They dragged him off to the church to be consecrated, while Rufus lay back on his pillows, exhausted but convinced he had bought his ticket out of hell. But Rufus didn't die. Within weeks, the fever broke. The color returned to his cheeks. The strength returned to his limbs. And with his health, his arrogance returned with a vengeance. He looked at the promises he had made on his deathbed, the tax relief, the amnesty for prisoners, and laughed. "Who can keep all his promises?" he asked. He ordered the prisoners back into the dungeons. He ordered Flambard to double the tax collection to make up for lost time. And then he looked at Anselm. He realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had installed a man of iron principles in the most powerful church office in the land. He couldn't fire him. Once a bishop, always a bishop. He was stuck with him. The relationship between William Rufus and Archbishop Anselm is one of the great psychological dramas of the Middle Ages. It was a clash of two absolute worldviews. Rufus believed the king was supreme, answering only to God. Anselm believed the church was supreme, answering only to Rome. Their first fight was about money. Rufus demanded a gift of 1,000 pounds of silver from Anselm to confirm his appointment. It was essentially a bribe. Anselm refused to pay a penny for a holy office. He offered 500 pounds as a voluntary donation. Rufus was insulted. "Keep your money and your rotting scowls," the king shouted. I have enough of my own." Their second fight was about soldiers. Rufus was planning a campaign in Normandy and demanded Anselm send his quota of knights. Anselm sent them, but they were ill-equipped and poorly trained. Rufus exploded in rage and threatened to put the archbishop on trial for treason. But the final straw was the issue of the pope. There was a schism in Rome, two men claiming to be pope. Rufus had not yet decided which one England would recognize. Anselm, however, had already recognized Pope Urban II. He asked permission to go to Rome to receive his pallium from Urban. Rufus saw this as an act of rebellion. "No one in my kingdom recognizes a pope unless I say so," he roared. "To challenge this is to try to take away my crown." In February 1095, the conflict came to a head at the Council of Rockingham. It was a show trial. The king summoned the bishops, abbots, and barons to Rockingham Castle in the dense forests of Northamptonshire. His goal was to force Anselm to submit or to force him to resign. The setting was intimidation theater. The king sat in a separate room with his inner circle, Flambard and the warrior barons, sending out messages like thunderbolts. In the main hall sat Anselm, alone on a wooden bench, surrounded by hostile bishops who were too afraid of the king to support their own leader. The bishops, led by the spineless William of St. Calais, badgered Anselm for hours. "Submit to the king," they hissed. "Forget the pope. The king is your master." Anselm sat quietly, while the angry debates raged around him, while men shouted and threatened. The old monk reportedly leaned his head against the wall and fell asleep. It was the ultimate power move. He was so certain of his moral position that the king's fury didn't even keep him awake. Rufus was apoplectic. He realized he couldn't break the old man. If he arrested Anselm, he would create a martyr. If he let him go, he looked weak. Ever the tactician, Rufus tried a different route. He sent a secret envoy to Rome. He acknowledged Pope Urban II, but on one condition: Urban must send the pallium to the king, not to Anselm, so the king could bestow it. Rufus wanted to show that the archbishop's power came from the crown, not the Vatican. The Pope, a politician himself, agreed. He sent the pallium. Rufus took the sacred woolen band and tried to make a deal with Anselm. "I will give you this," he said, "if you swear absolute loyalty to me and forget this nonsense about Rome." Anselm refused to bargain. He refused to take the pallium from the king's hands. In the end, they had to leave the pallium on the altar at Canterbury so Anselm could pick it up himself, bypassing the king entirely. It was a stalemate, but a stalemate that Rufus couldn't tolerate. He began to harass Anselm relentlessly. He blocked his agents, seized his tenants' goods, and made his life a misery. Finally, in 1097, Anselm had had enough. He asked permission to leave England to consult the Pope. Rufus grinned. This was what he had wanted all along. "If you go," he warned, "I will seize the archbishopric, and you will never return." Anselm blessed the king, who likely rolled his eyes, and boarded a ship at Dover. As soon as the sails disappeared over the horizon, Rufus sent Flambard's men into Canterbury. They stripped the cathedral of its wealth. They seized the vast estates. The king was once again the master of the church and the richest man in the kingdom. He had won. He had driven a living saint into exile and pocketed the profits. With the church crushed and the treasury full, Rufus turned his eyes outward. He was not just a playboy and a persecutor of monks. He was a dynamo of energy. During these years of conflict with Anselm, he was also redrawing the map of Britain. In the north, the King of Scots, Malcolm III, the man who had killed Macbeth, made the mistake of underestimating the fop with the pointed shoes. Malcolm raided Northumbria, thinking Rufus was too distracted by his arguments with bishops. Rufus didn't lead the army himself this time. He didn't need to. He had built a machine that worked without him. His wardens of the north trapped Malcolm near Alnwick. In a misty ambush, the Lion of Scotland was cut down. His son and heir died with him. Scotland was plunged into a succession crisis that Rufus manipulated masterfully, installing a puppet king who owed his throne to England. He secured the Welsh border by building a ring of massive stone castles. He didn't try to conquer the Welsh mountains. He knew that was a graveyard for armies. But he locked the Welsh inside their own country. By 1099, as the century drew to a close, William Rufus was the most successful king in Christendom. He controlled England absolutely. He held Normandy and Pawn. He dominated Scotland and Wales. The church was under his heel. His treasury was overflowing. He began to dream bigger. He talked of conquering Ireland. He talked of claiming the throne of France itself. The world is too small for a great king, he boasted. He commissioned the construction of a new great hall at Westminster, the largest hall in Europe. When his advisors told him it was too big, he laughed. Too big? It is a mere bedchamber compared to what I will build next. He was invincible. He was 40 years old. He had defeated every enemy, the barons, the Scots, his brother, even the archbishop. He stood at the pinnacle of the world, staring into a future that seemed limitless. But in the shadows of the New Forest, the trees were growing tall, and the threads of fate were being woven into a bowstring. The higher Rufus climbed, the more isolated he became. He had no son to watch his back. He had no wife to soften his edges. He had only mercenaries, flatterers, and a silent, brooding younger brother named Henry, who was counting every coin in the treasury and watching the king's health with the eyes of a hawk. The stage was set for the final hunt. The year 1100 dawned with a sky the color of bruised iron. It was a year that felt heavy with endings. In the Holy Land, the first Crusaders had just stormed Jerusalem, wading through blood to the Holy Sepulchre, a violent miracle that sent shock waves through Christendom. But in England, the mood was not one of triumph, but of suffocating dread. The summer was unnaturally hot. The crops in the fields shriveled under a relentless sun, and the tempers of men frayed. In the monasteries, the monks whispered that the peace of the land was broken. They wrote later that the very elements seemed to be revolting against the king. In Berkshire, at the village of Finchampstead, a spring of fresh water reportedly turned into a fountain of boiling gore, bubbling with fresh blood for 3 weeks, staining the surrounding earth a deep, accusing red. In the New Forest, that vast cursed hunting ground created by the Conqueror, woodcutters and charcoal burners reported seeing things that shouldn't exist. They spoke of a black goat with the face of a man walking on its hind legs. They spoke of hideous disembodied laughter echoing through the trees. The English peasants nodded knowingly. They knew the forest was haunted. The Conqueror had destroyed 36 churches and displaced dozens of villages to create this playground for his deer. It was a place built on sacrilege, and the devil, they said, was coming to collect his rent. William Rufus, ensconced in his palace at Westminster, publicly laughed at these stories. "Let the monks tremble at shadows," he scoffed. "I have a kingdom to rule." But privately, those close to him noticed a change. The king was restless. He was drinking more heavily. His famous temper was on a hair trigger. He was a man who had conquered every enemy of flesh and blood, but he was beginning to feel the pressure of an enemy he couldn't see. On August 1st, 1100, the king traveled to his hunting lodge at Brockenhurst in the New Forest. He brought with him a select company of friends and sycophants. It was meant to be a relaxing escape, a few days of sport to clear his head before he launched a new invasion of France. Among the party was his younger brother, Henry. Henry was now 32, a man in the prime of his life, but with nothing to show for it. He was landless, titleless, and entirely dependent on Rufus's charity. He rode in silence, his eyes always watching, his mind a steel trap of calculation. Also in the party was Walter Tyrrell, the Lord of Poix. Tyrrell was a visitor from France, a charming, arrogant aristocrat who was renowned as the finest archer in Europe. He and Rufus were thick as thieves, bonding over their shared love of the hunt and their disdain for the clergy. That night, the eve of the fatal day, the veil between the worlds seemed to tear. In the Abbey of Gloucester, a monk had a nightmare so vivid it sent him screaming to his abbot. He dreamed he saw the Lord Jesus seated on a high throne in glory. The Virgin Mary knelt before him weeping, pointing a finger at William Rufus. "Lord," she cried, "behold the man who oppresses your people and destroys your church. How long must we endure him?" And the Lord replied, in a voice like thunder, "Patience, his time is short." The abbot of Gloucester, terrified by the specificity of the dream, immediately wrote a letter to the king. He sent a messenger galloping through the night to deliver the warning. But the king had his own demons to fight. According to the chroniclers, Rufus slept fitfully that night. He woke up screaming in the darkness, shouting for his chamberlains. He told them he had dreamed he was being bled by a surgeon, but the flow of blood wouldn't stop. It rose up in a red column higher and higher until it blotted out the sun and plunged the world into darkness. He was so shaken that he refused to be left alone. He made his servants stay in the room, lighting lamps in every corner, and spent the rest of the night talking nervously, trying to chase away the silence. The morning of August 2nd broke bright and clear. The messenger from Gloucester arrived just as the king was being dressed. Rufus listened to the monk's dream of divine judgment. He paused for a moment, his face unreadable. Then the mask of the arrogant king slipped back into place. He burst out laughing. "He is a monk," Rufus sneered, waving the letter away. "He dreams for money like all the rest. Give him 100 shillings and tell him to dream better things next time." He turned to his companions. "Does he think I am like the English, who postpone their travels or business because of the dreams of snoring old women?" Yet, despite the bravado, Rufus did not ride out. He canceled the morning hunt. He claimed he had business to attend to, but he spent the hours pacing the lodge, checking his equipment, and drinking. At noon, the king ordered a feast. It was a heavy, gluttonous affair. The tables groaned with roasted meats, venison, and boar. The wine flowed like water. Rufus drank deeply, perhaps trying to drown the lingering unease of the night's terrors. His face became flushed, his voice loud and booming. By early afternoon, the alcohol had done its work. The fear was gone, replaced by a reckless, manic energy. "To horse!" he shouted. "We are wasting the day." As the party prepared to leave, a local armorer approached the king with a present: 6 brand new arrows. These were not ordinary arrows. They were works of art, perfectly balanced, with heads of sharpened steel designed to pierce the toughest hide. Rufus examined them with the eye of an expert. He took 4 for himself. Then he turned to Walter Tyrrell. He handed the remaining 2 arrows to the Frenchman. "Here, Walter," the king said, a strange smile playing on his lips. "The sharpest arrows for the man who knows how to shoot the deadliest strokes." It was a compliment. It was a jest. But in hindsight, it sounded like a script direction for a tragedy. The hunting party rode out into the forest. The noise was immense. The baying of hounds, the shouting of beaters, the thud of hooves. But as they entered the deeper woods, the group began to fragment. This was standard practice. The hunters would spread out to cover more ground. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the king found himself isolated. The noisy retinue faded into the distance. The trees grew thicker, the canopy blocking out the afternoon sun, creating a dappled, confusing light. By late afternoon, only 2 men remained together in a small glade known as Castle Malwood, King William Rufus and Walter Tyrrell. They dismounted, waiting for the beaters to drive the game towards them. The forest was silent, save for the wind in the oaks. The 2 men stood some distance apart, bows strung, eyes scanning the undergrowth. Suddenly a stag broke cover. It was a magnificent beast, panicked and fast, dashing between the 2 men. Rufus reacted instantly. He drew his bow and fired, but the alcohol, or perhaps the shadows, threw off his aim. The arrow flew wide, grazing the stag's back but not killing it. The animal stumbled but kept running. Rufus, desperate to see where his quarry went, raised his hand to shield his eyes from the low, dazzling sun. He stood there vulnerable, his chest exposed, his attention entirely focused on the fleeing animal. "Shoot, Walter! Shoot in the devil's name!" he reportedly shouted. Walter Tyrrell drew his bow. He was tracking a second animal, perhaps the same stag, perhaps another that had bolted. He swung his bow, tracking the movement. He released the string. The arrow hissed through the air, but it did not hit the stag. According to the official story that was later told to the world, the arrow struck the trunk of a massive oak tree. The wood was hard, the angle oblique. The arrow ricocheted with lethal velocity. It changed trajectory, flying across the clearing at a sharp angle. It struck William Rufus squarely in the center of his chest. The impact was catastrophic. The steel head punched through the ribs, likely severing the aorta or piercing the heart. Rufus did not scream. The shock was too great. He gasped a terrible wet sound. He reached down with both hands and grasped the shaft of the arrow protruding from his chest. With a final surge of strength, he snapped the wooden shaft off. Then he collapsed face forward into the mud. The broken shaft was driven deeper into his body by his own weight. His limbs twitched once, twice, and then the Red King was still. Walter Tyrrell stood frozen. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had ever known. The birds had stopped singing. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Tyrrell ran to the king's side. He turned the body over. The king's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the canopy of leaves. The blood was already pooling, dark and thick, soaking into the green tunic. There was no breath. Tyrrell looked up. He was alone with a dead king. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He knew how this looked. Accident or not, he had just killed the Lord's anointed. He would be torn apart by horses if he was caught. He didn't call for help. He didn't try to revive the corpse. He scrambled back to his horse, vaulted into the saddle, and dug his spurs into the animal's flanks. He rode as if the hounds of hell were snapping at his heels. He didn't stop at the lodge. He didn't stop at Winchester. He rode straight for the coast, bribed a boatman, and was in France before the news of the king's death had even left the forest. Back in the woods, other members of the hunting party began to arrive. They found the king lying in his own blood. And then the second shock of the day occurred. Prince Henry arrived. He looked down at his brother's body. He saw the arrow. He saw that Rufus was dead. A normal brother might have wept. A normal subject might have prayed. Henry did neither. His mind, cold and brilliant, instantly calculated the political calculus. Rufus was dead. Robert was thousands of miles away. The throne was empty. Henry turned his horse around. He shouted an order, not to attend to the body, but to his own men. To Winchester. He left his brother lying in the dirt. He galloped away, racing to seize the royal treasury. The other barons, seeing Henry leave, realized the game had changed. If they stayed with the body, they gained nothing. If they followed Henry, they might secure their future with the new king. One by one, they turned their horses. The glade emptied. For hours, the King of England lay alone. The insects began to gather. The sun sank lower, casting long, mournful shadows over the corpse. The man who had commanded armies, who had defied the Pope, who had built the great hall, was now just carrion. It was evening when a charcoal burner named Perkins came trundling down the track with his cart. He saw the splash of color in the bracken. He stopped his old nag and went to investigate. He recognized the king. He had seen him ride past many times, terrifying and splendid. Now the king was a broken doll. Perkins didn't know about politics. He only knew that a man shouldn't be left for the wolves. He and a few villagers lifted the heavy, stiffening body. They had no shroud, so they threw some filthy rags over him. They dumped him onto the back of the cart, on top of the charcoal dust. The cart creaked and groaned under the weight. As it bumped over the rough forest tracks, the wound in the king's chest opened. Blood dripped down through the slats of the cart, leaving a trail of red droplets in the dust, marking the long, lonely road to Winchester. The king was dead. The hunt was over. But the mystery was just beginning. While the charcoal burner's cart was still creaking its way through the darkened woods, leaving a trail of royal blood in the dust, the real drama was taking place 20 miles away in the courtyard of Winchester Castle. The death of William Rufus was a tragedy, but the rise of Henry the Fern was a heist. When Henry galloped into Winchester on that evening of August 2nd, 1100, he was exhausted, sweaty, and desperate. He knew exactly how precarious his position was. He was the youngest brother. By every law of God and man, the crown belonged to Robert Curthose, the eldest brother, who was at that very moment sailing back from the Crusades with a new wife and a chest full of gold. If Robert arrived before Henry was crowned, Henry would remain a landless prince forever, living on scraps from his brother's table. Henry rode straight to the royal treasury. This was the nerve center of the kingdom. In the 11th century, you didn't need a parliament to rule. You needed silver. The treasury at Winchester held the hoard of the Conqueror and the accumulated taxes of Rufus's reign, barrels of silver pennies, gold plate, and jewels. Whoever held the keys held the army, and whoever held the army held the throne. But there was an obstacle. Standing in front of the heavy iron-bound doors of the treasury was William of Breteuil. Breteuil was the man responsible for the hoard. He was also a man of honor. He had ridden hard from the forest as well, perhaps suspecting exactly what Henry was planning. When the prince demanded the keys, Breteuil refused. "This treasure belongs to your brother Robert," Breteuil declared, his hand on his sword. "He is the firstborn. He is the lawful heir. You and I both swore an oath of homage to him. Do not add theft to the tragedy of this day." It was a tense cinematic standoff, a breathless, dust-covered prince facing down a stubborn bureaucrat. A crowd of barons and soldiers gathered around, watching. This was the moment history hung in the balance. If Henry backed down, the Plantagenet dynasty as we know it would never exist. Henry did not back down. He didn't argue legalities. He drew his sword. "I am the son born on English soil," Henry shouted, stepping forward. "The keys or your life." The threat was real. The crowd sensed that Henry was ready to cut Breteuil down where he stood. Breteuil looked at the eyes of the young prince, cold, hard, and utterly ruthless, and realized that loyalty to a distant duke was not worth dying for. He stepped aside. He handed over the keys. Henry entered the vault. He didn't just take a few bags, he seized the state. He immediately began paying out the barons standing nearby, buying their loyalty on the spot. In the flickering torchlight of the treasury, the coup was solidified. The next morning, August 3rd, the body of William Rufus finally arrived. The contrast between the frantic energy of Henry's power grab and the pathetic disposal of the dead king is one of the most haunting juxtapositions in English history. Rufus was not laid out in state. There was no lying in honor. The monks of Winchester, terrified and confused, washed the mud and blood from the corpse, but they refused to perform the full ecclesiastical rites. To the church, Rufus had died unshriven. He had been struck down while hunting, a frivolous pursuit, and he had died without confessing his sins. In their eyes, his soul was already in hell. Why waste prayers on the damned? They dug a hasty grave under the crossing of the cathedral tower. A plain stone was slapped over it. A few psalms were muttered. And that was it. The man who had terrified Europe for 13 years was put into the ground like a pauper. The crowd that gathered was sullen. Some wept. Rufus had been a generous patron to the poor in Winchester, but many felt a grim satisfaction. The tyrant was gone. Henry did not attend the burial. He was too busy. He was already on the road to London. The speed of Henry's movements in the next 48 hours is breathtaking. He left Winchester on August 3rd. He arrived in London on August 4th. On Sunday, August 5th, just 3 days after the arrow was fired, he was crowned King Henry I in Westminster Abbey. There was no time for a proper preparation. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, was still in exile. The Archbishop of York was far away in the north. So, Henry grabbed the Bishop of London and forced him to perform the ceremony. As the oil was poured on his head, Henry knew he was sitting on a throne of bayonets. The barons were wary. The people were terrified that he would be another Rufus, cruel, rapacious, and godless. So Henry played his masterstroke. He issued the Charter of Liberties. This document was a piece of brilliant political propaganda. Copies were made and written to every shire in England. In it, Henry essentially confessed to all the crimes of his dead brother's regime and promised to stop them. I, Henry, by the grace of God, King of the English, because the kingdom has been oppressed by unjust exactions, I, out of respect for God and the love which I have for you all, make the Holy Church of God free. I abolish all the evil customs by which the kingdom of England has been unjustly oppressed. He promised to stop selling church offices. He promised to stop taxing inheritances unfairly. He promised to restore the laws of Edward the Confessor. It was a contract. I will be the anti-Rufus. Love me, support me, and I will be the boring, pious, law-abiding king you always wanted. To seal the deal, Henry needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to blame for the misery of the last 13 years. He chose Ranulph Flambard, Rufus's hated tax collector. Flambard was still in London, probably wondering if he could cut a deal with the new regime. Henry didn't give him the chance. He had Flambard arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. He became the first recorded prisoner in the Tower. The people cheered. Henry was their hero. He had jailed the taxmen. But amidst all this flurry of activity, the coronation, the charter, the arrests, there was one glaring omission. There was no manhunt for Walter Tyrrell. Think about it. The King of England had been violently killed. The man who fired the shot had fled the country. In any normal circumstances, this would be an act of high treason. Agents would be dispatched to France. Extradition would be demanded. A bounty would be placed on Tyrrell's head. Henry did nothing. He didn't demand Tyrrell's return. He didn't confiscate Tyrrell's wife's estates. He simply let the matter drop. It was as if he wanted everyone to forget how Rufus died and just focus on the fact that he was dead. Walter Tyrrell made it safely to his estates in France. He lived out the rest of his life in comfort, but he was haunted by the accusation. Until his dying day, he swore to anyone who would listen. I did not kill the king. I was not even in the same part of the forest as him. If Tyrrell didn't shoot the arrow, who did? And if Tyrrell did shoot it, why did Henry let him go? The answer may lie in the family connections of the hunting party. Walter Tyrrell was married to a woman named Adeliza. Adeliza was the daughter of Richard Fitzgilbert, a member of the powerful Clare family. The Clares were the key. Gilbert de Clare and his brother Roger were in the hunting party that day. They were the ones who discovered the body. They were the ones who rode with Henry to Winchester. The Clares had been close to Henry for years. They had calculated that their fortunes would rise higher under Henry than under the unpredictable Rufus. It is highly probable that the accident was a conspiracy involving the Clare family and Henry. Tyrrell may have been the designated shooter, or he may have been the designated patsy, a foreigner who could easily flee, taking the blame with him, while the real assassin slipped away in the chaos. Henry rewarded the Clares handsomely in the years to come. They became one of the richest families in England. It was blood money, laundered through royal grants. But Henry wasn't safe yet. The specter of his brother Robert still loomed. In September 1100, Robert Curthose finally returned to Normandy. He was flush with glory from the crusade. He expected to come home, cross the Channel, and claim his English inheritance. Instead, he found that his little brother had stolen his crown, his treasury, and his barons. Robert was furious. He began to muster an invasion fleet. The Anglo-Norman barons, consistent in their treachery, began to plot against Henry just as they had plotted against Rufus. They preferred Robert. Robert was lazy. Robert was fun. Henry was scary. Henry needed to shore up his support, and he needed to do it fast. He looked at the English population, the defeated Saxons. He needed them to love him more than they loved the Norman barons. So he did something unthinkable. He married an English princess. Edith was the daughter of the King of Scots, but more importantly, her mother was of the royal house of Wessex. She was the great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, a direct descendant of Alfred the Great. By marrying her, Henry united the bloodline of the Norman conquerors with the bloodline of the old Saxon kings. It was a propaganda victory of immense proportions. The Norman barons mocked him. They called the couple Godric and Godgifu, Saxon peasant names, sneering at the king for going native. Henry didn't care. When Robert finally landed his invasion force at Portsmouth in 1101, Henry marched out to meet him, not just with Norman knights, but with a massive army of Englishmen who cheered for the king who had married one of their own. The brothers met near Alton. It should have been a bloodbath, but Henry, ever the politician, bought his brother off. He used the very silver he had stolen from Rufus's treasury to pay Robert a massive annual pension of £2,000 to go back home and leave England alone. Robert, broke and lazy, took the money. He signed the Treaty of Alton and sailed back to Normandy. He had sold his birthright for cash. Henry had survived. He had weathered the storm. The crown was securely on his head, but the ghost of the New Forest would not vanish so easily. As Henry settled into his reign, establishing a governance of cold, terrifying efficiency, the stories about Rufus's death began to mutate. The church, now fully restored to power, began to write the history of the event. They couldn't allow it to be a murder, because that would make Henry a fratricide and a usurper. But they couldn't call it a simple accident, because that lacked moral meaning. So they crafted the narrative of divine judgment. They wrote that Rufus was shot by an arrow guided by the hand of God. They turned Walter Tyrrell into an unwilling agent of the Almighty. This version suited everyone. It absolved Henry of murder, and it validated the church's power. However, the physical world seemed to offer a darker commentary. 7 years after the burial, in 1107, the central tower of Winchester Cathedral, the one standing directly over Rufus's hasty grave, suddenly cracked. The masonry groaned, the pillars buckled, and with a roar that shook the city, the massive stone structure collapsed. The monks said it was because the earth could not bear the weight of the sinful king. It was a final exclamation point to the church's condemnation. But looking back from the distance of centuries, the collapse feels like a metaphor for the cover-up itself. The official story was a heavy, ornate structure built on a foundation of lies and secrets. Eventually, the weight of the truth, or the weight of the guilt, caused the whole edifice to crumble. Henry the Learned would rule for 35 years. He would be known as the Lion of Justice. He would bring peace to England, a peace so absolute that it was said a woman could walk across the kingdom with a bag of gold and not be molested. But he was a man of ice. He never smiled. He blinded his own grandchildren when they rebelled. He imprisoned his brother Robert for 28 years in Cardiff Castle, letting him rot in darkness until he died at the age of 80. He was a man capable of anything, and it all started in that clearing with a brother left bleeding in the dirt. 900 years have passed since the arrow flew. The New Forest is still there, ancient and quiet, its mossy oaks standing like silent witnesses to the crime or the accident that changed the world. As we stand at the end of this long, bloody journey, we are left with the final task of the historian, not just to recount how William Rufus died, but to understand who he was and what was lost when he fell. For centuries, the reputation of the Red King has been buried under a landslide of clerical propaganda. The monks who wrote the history books achieved their revenge. They painted him as a cartoon villain, a red-faced, swearing, blaspheming brute who terrorized the innocent and engaged in unspeakable vices. They made him a cautionary tale of what happens when a man turns his back on God. But if we scrape away the layers of moral outrage, a different figure emerges, a figure who is startlingly modern. William Rufus was not a monster. He was a professional. In an age of religious hysteria, Rufus was a pragmatist. He looked at the church and saw not a divine mystery, but a competing corporation. The church held 25% of the land, paid no tax, and claimed to be above the law. Rufus was the first English king to try to break this monopoly. He treated bishops like barons and abbeys like cash cows. When historians call him impious, they are often describing a man who simply refused to be bullied by superstition. Remember his reaction to the monk's dream on the morning of his death. He dreams for money. That is the voice of a cynic, yes, but also the voice of a rationalist. In a world where kings were expected to tremble at omens, Rufus laughed. He anticipates the struggle between church and state that would define English history for the next 500 years. In many ways, he was a Henry VIII, born 4 centuries too early, but without the 6 wives. And then there is his vice. William Rufus is a singular figure in the history of the English monarchy because he refused to play the game of dynastic marriage. Every other king used women as brood mares to secure treaties and breed heirs. Rufus refused. He lived his life surrounded by men, promoting them, loving them, and shielding them from the wrath of the pulpit. The court of long hair and pointed shoes wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a counterculture. It was a rejection of the grim, hyper-masculine, war-obsessed values of his father's generation. It was a space where aesthetics, wit, and beauty were valued over brute strength. For a gay or queer man in the 11th century, the pressure to conform must have been crushing. Rufus didn't just resist that pressure, he threw it back in society's face from the height of the throne. His physical legacy proves he was a visionary. He built the Great Hall at Westminster. Stand in it today. It is cavernous, majestic, a soaring space of timber and stone. It was the largest hall in Europe when it was built. It was meant to be the administrative heart of an empire. When his advisors gasped at its size, he famously said, "This is but a bedchamber to what I have in mind." He dreamed of a London that would rival Rome. He wasn't a barbarian, he was a builder. But the arrow stopped the dream. So what happened in the forest? We must look at the cold, hard facts of the succession. The death of Rufus was the most convenient death in political history. If Rufus lives another month, his brother Robert returns to Normandy. The balance of power holds. Rufus continues to consolidate his empire. Henry remains a nobody. Because Rufus dies on that specific day, Henry becomes the richest, most powerful man in Europe within 72 hours. The evidence points to a cold, professional coup. The presence of the Clare family, who gained immense wealth under the new king, and Henry's refusal to pursue the alleged killer speaks volumes. Walter Tyrrell was likely just a convenient scapegoat, a foreigner framed to cover a meticulously planned assassination. It was the perfect crime, where the only victim was the man who wore the crown. It was a coup d'etat. It was a professional hit, and it worked. The accident narrative was so successful that even today history books often list it as a hunting mishap. It was the perfect crime because everyone who mattered benefited from it. The church got rid of a blasphemer. The barons got a king who was willing to sign a charter of liberties. And Henry got the crown. The only victim was Rufus. His death plunged England into a new trajectory. Henry I ruled with a rod of iron, but his line ended in disaster. His only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster. This led to a civil war called the Anarchy, a period when Christ and his saints slept. One has to wonder, if Rufus had lived, would he have eventually married? Or would he have named a successor on his own terms? Would he have conquered France? Would the Reformation have started in 1100 instead of 1530? We will never know. Today, if you travel to the New Forest, you can find the Rufus stone. It is a modest ironclad pillar in a quiet glade near the village of Minstead. It is allegedly the spot where the oak tree stood. It is a lonely place. The tourists come, take a photo, and leave. The woods are silent. There is a profound sadness to the story of William Rufus. He was a man who possessed absolute power, yet he died utterly alone. He was abandoned by his brother, abandoned by his friends, abandoned by his church. He was left to rot in the mud until a peasant with a cart took pity on him. He is the bachelor king, the outsider who sat on the throne, the man who tried to live by his own rules in a world that demanded submission. History is written by the winners, and the winners were Henry and the monks. They tried to erase Rufus, to turn him into a two-dimensional villain, but they failed because 900 years later, we are still talking about him. We are still asking questions. And as long as we ask, the Red King is not truly dead. He stands there in the forest shadows, a smirk on his face, the most fascinating, mysterious, and human of all England's conquerors. The arrow struck his heart, but it could not kill his story.